Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we're looking at 5 inside secrets to successful sustainability data management. This is being hosted by myself, Jake Yule, and I am the Client Services Manager here at Greenstone. And before we get into the actual content and the 5 areas we'll be looking at, a bit of admin. So this is a short webinar today, just 30 minutes, so we will not be having an official Q&A section at the end, but please still use the question function provided, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. And if we do not manage to ask anything immediately, then we will follow up with anything asked after the webinar. And we can also share a recording on this webinar afterwards as requested. Okay, so this is what we'll be looking at today. Firstly, a bit of background on Greenstone, then we'll be looking at the actual 5 secrets. So firstly, looking for champions within your organization, defining a clear process prior to rollout, being clear on why you're collecting data, utilizing healthy competition to breed engagement, and finally gathering case studies and any data really throughout the year rather than once at the end. So firstly, a bit about Greenstone. For those of you who do not know, we are a global provider of sustainability reporting software services, and we've been helping clients measure and report their non-financial data since 2007. We provide software that covers environment, CSR frameworks, health and safety, and supply chain areas. And all of that is shown on a slide here. So all of our solutions are cloud-based, SaaS-hosted platforms, and we are used globally by organizations in multiple sectors covering professional services, financial services, manufacturing, government departments, and many others. So the software is flexible and can be used by any type of organization. And our key differentiator is our brand promise of data that talks to you. And by this, we mean that we don't just provide you with the software, but will also work with you to ensure that you get everything out of the system that you need to fulfill your reporting needs. We understand that sustainability reporting and the landscape is not always straightforward, and there will often be hurdles along the way, which I'm sure some of you have experienced. And rather than profit from that, we offer all our clients uncapped support and a named account manager from our team of sustainability consultants. So you can use this support for system requests such as, forgotten login details and simple things like that, but also for asking for advice on more technical areas relating to the challenges of reporting and data collection. Okay, so on to the content of today's webinar and the first of our 5 secrets to successful sustainability data management, which is looking for champions within the organization. So this is the first secret because even the best data collection process will not really work and prosper without the right people carrying it out. And this is true for data collection, but also for reporting and for implementing environmental or sustainability initiatives. And this is because the individuals and the team you have in place really will determine how reliable your data is and processes, how consistent your data is, and how accurate your data is, so the integrity of the numbers and information that you'll be reporting. So how can you select and identify who should be included in your data collection process? Well, the main point here is that the more passionate the contacts are about what you're trying to achieve, the more engaged in the process they will be, and therefore the better the reporting opportunities and the overall outcomes will be. So here at Greenstone, we often see that the facilities management teams are designated responsibility, and that could be either running the whole process or just resourcing information for individual sites. And this can work well. Facilities teams should have easy access to the data that's needed, and they often will have the best understanding of the makeup of offices and locations, for example, energy profiles, waste providers, floor space, and any other essential information. So I'm not saying do not use that knowledge, but I would certainly recommend that you also consider whether there are any passionate people in other areas of your company that may also be able to drive action and innovate. It's important to remember that it will rarely be people's primary day job, so you need to ensure that they give enough care and attention to the process. And it's also worth noting that these people do not have to come from a particular level or department of the organization, so don't overlook someone just because of their position. So once you have selected the right people, you then want to ensure that they stay engaged in the data collection process. Otherwise, the level of commitment, the accuracy of data, etc., will start to drop off. And how do we do this? Well, the first step of selecting the right people we've just covered, but we also then want to involve the contacts in the process as much as possible and also communicate back to them regularly. So involvement is important as people are far more engaged if they feel valued within the process and the decision making, rather than just being told what to do. Now, depending on who the contacts are, it may not always be feasible to fully include them in the decision making, but just simply asking for their views and opinions on the process will certainly help. And communicating back to them is also key. It's another common pitfall that we see from our work here at Greenstone. If the people who are sourcing and providing data do not have visibility of why they're doing it and what the data is actually being used for, they will not appreciate the value of committing properly to the process. And then they won't give the proper care and attention that the data needs. So this does not have to be complicated. Even just sending around your annual report and saying thanks can make a big difference. And that may seem like a very simple thing, but it's not always done. And also communicating back within the year can be even more effective. So if you can, just a simple quarterly update report showing trends and any issues, highlighting that kind of thing, can also really help. And the final point here is about using your champions, not just for collecting and providing data and managing that side of things, but also for implementing initiatives. And you'll often find that with the right level of senior management buy-in, the employees most passionate about sustainability will be the most effective at driving change. And that is particularly true for areas such as behaviour change campaigns. Okay, so that was our first top tip, and our next point is to define a clear process prior to rollout. So again, this may sound pretty obvious, but it really is important to have a clear and detailed plan which has been defined and written down. The sustainability reporting space and landscape is complex with multiple and sometimes contrasting requirements across regulations, frameworks, best practice, etc., etc. And without a clear process that everyone understands and can work in harmony towards, you will end up scrambling to keep up to date. And we also have the unfortunate point that personnel do move and people do leave organizations. So it's a big risk if key knowledge areas of the process and collection cycle sits with just individuals, as if they leave, then there'll be a significant knowledge gap. So to define the data collection process that you need, there are a number of key things shown on the slide here that you should consider and incorporate. Firstly, define the scale and scope. So which parts of the organization, whether sites, regions, etc., need to be included, if not everything. And then what types of data do you actually need, whether you're just collecting your internal resource consumption to calculate your scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions, or whether it also needs to include social metrics, narratives, initiatives, health and safety performance, etc., etc. And what determines the scale and scope can be worked out by what the drivers are for reporting in the first place. And that's something we'll look at on the next slide. So next, you need to identify data contacts and the sources. So we've already talked a bit about the contacts, but you also need to identify where each data point comes from and map this against the data contacts. So you want to have a clear matrix of where the data comes from and who is responsible for it. Next, we have set responsibilities and collection frequencies, and this quite clearly follows on from identifying the contacts and sources. So you obviously need to define who is responsible for doing what within a process, but also determine how frequently data needs to be provided. So whether that's monthly, quarterly, annually, etc. And where possible, having one frequency for all data does make things a bit easier and more aligned. But it is common for certain types of data, maybe normalization, so floor area or FTE figures, to be sourced as frequently than others. So where possible, try and align it, but know that it's fine for some areas where it's not needed all the time to be done less frequently. And generally, from our experience of working with clients, the more frequent the data collection, the better. So monthly is often the aim, as this provides more consistency in the process. But the best way to determine what frequency you need is to consider the output requirements. So if the most frequently you will be reporting is quarterly, and this level of visibility works for you, then that will likely be the best approach. Next, we have determined data review process. So ensure that there is a clear process for checking A, the completeness of data, but then also the integrity. So for example, every quarter, Stephen in the UK will be checking that all data required from across Europe has been provided. And then we'll do a variance check to see if any data points have been changed by more or less than 5% from last quarter. And that's from the same period last year as well. And if this variance has been exceeded, then a full explanation is requested from the source of the data. So a clear process like that is followed consistently just ensures that you have full confidence in your data that will eventually be communicated externally, internally, whenever is needed. We then have create reporting structures based on your requirements. So understanding exactly what your reporting requirements are and where possible setting up ready-to-use reporting structures. So for example, if you are producing an internal senior management report every quarter, understand what information the management team are looking for and create a structure that will allow you to simply fit the data in every period. So that may not always be possible, and for certain types of reporting, such as complex frameworks that are ever-changing, it may not be possible. But when you can do it, it certainly saves a lot of time. And finally, communicate progress. This is pretty self-explanatory, but ensure that your process clearly defines how data is going to be reported, and that should cover all requirements, both internal and external, and include any known deadlines that can be worked towards. Great, so the third area is to be clear on why you are collecting data. So it's always important to consider the aims of reporting. So what are your targets? What are the drivers? What is the overall purpose of going through the process? So we have a few things here on the screen that could cover your organization's reporting reasons, and that can include simply communicating success stories. It could be to secure your position in the market or work towards being an industry leader. It could be due to increased pressure from stakeholders to show that you are taking sustainability issues seriously. It could be primarily driven by requests for information from clients. It could be from customer requests and expectations, or more likely, it could be a combination of all of these points. So considering all of this is really important, as it will indicate what level of reporting you need to work towards, which frameworks you'll be using, etc., etc. And this will then clearly show you what data you actually need to collect. And when looking at the points about stakeholder pressures and expectations, it is very important to consider both internal and external stakeholder groups, because these will really want to require data to be communicated in different ways. And I've got a couple of examples in a couple of slides' time from our clients, which shows data presented in different ways for different audiences. But firstly, to really understand your stakeholders' views and therefore what they expect from you in terms of reporting, a key way to do that is to undertake a materiality assessment. So I'm sure some of you, or a number of you, are very familiar with this, but the concept really came to the forefront when GRI placed significant emphasis on it when they released the G4 version of their reporting guidelines, which has since become the updated GRI standards. So materiality essentially means defining the topics that matter most to your business and stakeholders. And that's both internal stakeholders, such as employees, but also external ones, such as investors and customers. And this is a vital step of the overall data management and reporting process, as it really identifies where you can make the greatest impact. And then what your stakeholders really want to see in your communications, it tells you that as well. So how do you undertake a materiality assessment? Well, there are a number of things that you should assess during the process. Firstly, consider both current and future impacts. Strategies, operations, everything else change over time, and it should not be ignored during the process. Be sure also to focus on both positive and negative impacts. Often companies will just focus on the areas that are likely to have a negative impact, but it's also essential that the positive ones are considered as well. Geographical context is also key. Ensure you consider the proximity of activities in relation to locations that have a low performance in particular areas, such as a country with poor labour rights, or the need for increased levels of sustainable energy, etc., etc. And finally, and this is the key one really, is to ask your stakeholders what they think, and be sure to take into account both internal and external groups. And on the bottom right here of the slide, we have a way of visualizing and demonstrating the outcome of the materiality assessment stage. And this can be communicated to anyone really, to show you to have really considered stakeholder views and gone through the process of prioritizing aspects. So that's in terms of impact on the bottom, on the x-axis, but then also the influence on stakeholders on the y-axis. And now we have a couple of examples of how different companies report in different ways for different stakeholder groups. And the first one here is from Barclays Bank and from their annual sustainability report. So you'll see here that we have quite a bit of text and then a clear display on the right of the actual numbers without many graphics or visuals. But this is quite suited to the type of stakeholder who may be viewing a financial annual report. And the second example is from one of our clients here at Greenstone Fujitsu. And you can see here an instant difference with far more reliance on graphics and the visual representations of data. And this is from their communication of Fujitsu's responsible business pillars. And this could be viewed by a far wider set of stakeholders, and that's why a more graphical approach works. So the point here is not that one approach is better, but that when producing reports, you need to understand why you're reporting, who you're reporting to, and then how best to report to that particular set of people. Our next top tip on successful data management is to utilize competition or healthy competition to drive engagement. So there are two sides of this, the internal side and then the external side. And to start with, we'll be looking at how you can use competition to breed engagement internally. So the general point here is that when done in the correct way, and when the competition is a positive and healthy one, it can be a fundamental driver for innovation. And this isn't just true for data collection, but also for driving change generally, for new ideas around initiatives that can be implemented, etc., etc. So how can you implement a healthy and positive competition? Well, one of the key ways is to use incentives based on performance. So not all companies are comfortable with implementing this, and it can be difficult to get buy-in from senior management, but where possible, it can really make quite a big difference. So examples could be monetary or budget increases for departments that reduce their carbon emissions, for example. They reduce that by the most in a given time period. And this would not just result in driving action, but also result in better data, as the departments will not actually be able to track their reductions without a clear and accurate data set. Another way is to use internal league tables or ranking, so measuring and comparing like-for-like areas of the business. So this could be done at any level, maybe sites, offices, business units, departments, regions, whatever works for you. And you don't need to specifically rank and actually give a first and last place out, but just having a simple bit of analysis that shows side-by-side performance, and that can be communicated regularly, could have a big impact. So no one really likes to see that they're being outperformed, so it really can drive action and change when they see yourself amongst your similar peers. And a key thing here is to use normalized data to compare. So for example, per employee emissions or kilowatt hours of electricity. And so just make sure that it's a fair comparison. And the final method is to utilize technology. So this could be essential software solutions such as Greenstone, where individual employees and maybe departments can log in and easily track performance against others. Or it could be using other bits of tech. One example being there are mobile apps now that allow employees to enter initiatives. Green Rewards is one example of this, where employees can basically track and record what they have done, for example, waste and recycling activities, and then get points based on what they have done and track how they're doing against their colleagues. So this is another great method for using the competitive nature of people to drive action. So now on to the external side of our fourth point about competition. And as we've just talked about, competition is a key way to drive improvements, but it doesn't just have to be internally. You can also utilize your peers and competitors externally to achieve similarly positive outcomes. And the main part of this is to place yourself amongst your peers and fully understand where you sit in the marketplace. So are there areas within sustainability reporting that competitors are generally doing better than you? Understanding this can be used to highlight areas internally to senior management, etc., where you need to improve, highlight that, and then you can use your core competitors basically to get buy-in and get people to listen to what you need to do. But equally, are there any areas that you're doing better than your competitors? And this is also very valuable to understand, as it means you can focus on these areas even more and really push communications in this area that really emphasize your strengths and differentiators. So this is all about understanding your current position in the market and using that to determine your overall ambition. So do you want to be a market leader? Do you want to just align yourself with your peers and competitors, etc., etc.? And obviously, this is not a new thing at all, but to understand your position in this way, you need to undertake a full benchmarking exercise or a competitor review. And that should really be one of the very first steps that you take with defining your overall collection and reporting process. And the other part of this is to utilize sector-based collaborations and partnerships to continue the driving of that improvement. So this is when competition gets very healthy and positive, and where similar companies actually come together to share insights, market knowledge, best practice opportunities, etc. And one example of this that we know very well here at Greenstone is the one for the legal sector in the UK, and that's the LSA, or Legal Sustainability Alliance. And we provide the software and data support for the emissions calculations part of their work. And we've seen lots of great stuff that the sector has done collaboratively to improve things and generally to just reduce their overall impact. And there are a lot of these collaborations out there, so it would definitely be worth looking around to see if there are any suitable ones that can help you and your company's specific journey. Okay, so on to the final inside secret now for sustainability data success. And this one is about gathering case studies initiatives throughout the year, rather than in one stressful and time-pressured process right at the end. And the first point to make here is to emphasize the importance of the qualitative side of data. So don't just rely on the pure numbers. So the numbers and the actual quantitative data is obviously very important and essential, really. We also need narratives and stories to bring life to numbers and trends that you're communicating. And this graphic at the bottom basically highlights that, showing that you need to combine data with stories to really produce engaging and effective communications. So what is the best way to collect the soft or qualitative side of sustainability data? This is often something that we see organizations struggling with in terms of not having the stories at hand. And it's usually not because there's nothing happening across the organization. It's generally just because there's a lack of knowledge around it and lack of visibility of what's going on. And when organizations then do go out to find out what is going on, there's often a lot of initiatives being undertaken and interesting stories that can be told, which just wasn't known about beforehand. So one of the best ways of getting visibility of these stories or narratives is to integrate the process with other data collection, so the more quantitative stuff that may already be in place. One example is to ask contacts who are providing environmental data to explain any trends and differences in the data. So if one of your international offices saw a drop-off in electricity use, then asking them to consistently explain why that is happening could highlight an initiative that's been undertaken and wouldn't have been aware of before. And another key way is to promote and actively share best practice across your organization. So if one department, region, or division has successfully improved their sustainability and performance, then communicating that success to the rest of the organization would really help. So that was a couple of ways that can help with actually collecting the narratives to go alongside your data. But the main part of this fifth and final area is the when and not the how. And this actually applies to any type of data, whether qualitative or quantitative. So traditionally, and this is something that's still happening quite a lot in the sustainability space, is that companies go through a very rigorous and time-consuming collection process once a year, say for an annual report, sustainability report. There's almost a reliance on the reporting deadline to rush around and scramble the data in at the last minute before putting it all together and getting the report out. Now, generally, this rush is not out of choice, and organizations are often, almost prevented from doing anything else due to resource constraints. Maybe there's just one person who spends half of their time doing sustainability for the whole company. But a recent trend that is happening, and something that we would certainly recommend at least aiming for, is to move away from that once a year collection cycle and instead move towards a more continuous data collection and reporting process. And this is especially important considering the complex nature of reporting these days. So there are loads of frameworks and requirements out there. You could be reporting against CDP, which I'm sure a number of you are having fun finalizing at the moment. But you could also be reporting against GRI, DGSI, UN Global Compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, to name just a few. And this is just the external side. You could also have a number of internal reporting requirements, request information from investors, just regular internal updates, etc., etc. And one of the main challenges here is that each one of these reporting mechanisms will have a different requirement in terms of the actual data required, but also will require you to produce the data at different times throughout the year. So having a deadline-based collection method to respond basically becomes unmanageable, even if you have entire teams of dedicated resource available to respond to such mechanisms. And this diagram on the slide here just highlights that ideal process to have in place. So with the various data contacts at the top, feeding data into the central system throughout the year. And this can then create a continuous bank of data that can be pulled on at different times and in different ways to respond to the various reporting mechanisms. But yeah, this is not an easy thing to achieve, but if you can and get towards that, it will just mean that instead of relying on deadlines and going through the stress and pains that come with that, you can move towards having a more constant set of data that can be pulled on quite easily when needed. Okay, so that concludes our webinar on the 5 inside secrets to successful sustainability data management. We've had a look at looking for champions within your organization, defining a clear process prior to rollout, being clear on why you're collecting data, using healthy competition to breed engagement, and finally, gather case studies, initiatives, and any data really throughout the year rather than right at the end. So I hope you all found that useful. My contact details are on the screen now, so if you want to discuss any of the points further, please do get in touch. And we'll also go through any of the questions that have been asked during the presentation, respond to them directly afterwards. Okay, thanks everyone. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.